Northwest of the forest of Farinost and the distant high kingdom of Ohnugdor lies the great Ogorial Plains. A rugged land dominated by the Urukeen, great bestial birds whose sharp talons could easily tear a man in half. It was here, in this hostile domain, that the story of the Nephiric horde would begin. With the guidance of the Allfather, the nomad warriors tamed the haughty and noble Ogorial Plains. With their newfound steeds, and armed with bow and arrow, they would be able to slay the Urukeen, and in so doing, elevating themselves from prey to predator. But the Urukeen were not the only threat. From the north, they were plagued by horrific monstrosities, the Gurukar, a people cursed with terrible deformities, no longer quite human, but rather having become something darker and sinister. The young and healthy would be stolen away in the night, only to return misshapen and transformed, and full of bloodlust. For safety, the scattered Ogorial tribes were forced to unite into larger communities, and with the aid of the Great Spirits were able to fend off the Gurukar. Though now the masters of their land, the steppe was far from safe. The tribes would remain migratory in order to better ensure their safety and more easily hunt for food. Their undisputed dominion of the Ogorial would not last. From the west, a powerful empire began to expand into the Great Plains. While fierce and fearless warriors, due to their nomadic tribal nature, the people of the Ogorial were no match for an organized military invasion. Skirmish after skirmish, their losses grew, and their hard-fought lands fell to their assailants. As the Empire erected fortifications and employed large military patrols, the disorganized Ogorial tribes were forced to make a bitter choice: either stay and try to fight, or to leave their ancestral homeland. A few of the tribes decided to migrate southeast, choosing to live as raiders and brigands in the high kingdom of Ohnugdor. But the greater part of their numbers, scattered and leaderless, remained paralyzed by indecision, unable to find the right path for their people. But then, a great shaman stepped forward, a man by the name of Atark Zahn, a gifted son of Gurchel, and one of the very few who had mastered all of the elements under the Allfather: fire, earth, water, and air. He would become the Ohnugdor, speaker for the Allfather, and the spiritual leader of the tribes. Soon, the chiefs were brought to heel and united under a common purpose, for it was clear Atark Zahn carried the words of the Allfather, and who could disobey the will of Gurchel? As if a sign from the Allfather himself, news of a civil war erupting to the southeast in the empire of Astria reached Atark's ears. This was an opportunity the Ohnugdor would not miss, for a land in disarray was a land in which his people could carve themselves a new sanctuary. The now united tribes would undertake a great migration to these fertile but distant lands. Though a meager few would stubbornly remain in their homeland, unwilling to abandon the Ogorial they had always known. To spearhead their long journey, Atark would form a new tribe, uniting the scattered remnants of his people. They would be the largest and greatest tribe of them all, the Nephir, sons of the Allfather. But they would not head to the high kingdom of Ohnugdor like the tribes that left before them. The Nephir would bypass Ohnugdor by taking to the shadows of the dense forests of Farinost. They would instead strike at the high kingdom of Salangard. The tribes of the mesas within Farinost would not warn Salangard of the Nephir's approach, as they were a secluded and highly superstitious people. The darkest depths of the woodlands of Farinost were rumored to be haunted by nightmarish creatures, but the Ohnugdor, his people in tow, bravely pressed on, with claws that could rend scores of men in a single strike, and a beak that could pierce steel plate. These beasts would prove to be far deadlier than the Urukeen their people had once conquered. Upon witnessing one of these spear beaks, as their people had come to call them, single-handedly massacre an entire column of men, Atark decided to step forward. Alone, and without even the aid of the spirits, the Ohnugdor faced fear itself manifest before him. Much like Gurchel had tempered the great spirits, Atark meant to subdue this brute creature. Locked in a long and fierce contest of strength and resolve, his people gathered in witness to this deed. Atark finally stood before the broken creature as it bowed not only to his will, but to the unyielding spirit of man. The Ohnugdor bestowed upon it the name Mehen-Tahin, and henceforth would ride it into battle. The champions of the Nephir would seek to prove themselves by following Atark's example, although few would succeed as the Ohnugdor had. Greeted by the welcoming embrace of the sun, the sons of the All-Father emerged from the shadows of Farinost in triumph. But their passage had not gone unnoticed. As they crossed into the High Kingdom of Sovngarde, they were waylaid by a combined army of Astrian and Sovngarde troops who had been waiting for their arrival. Atark Zahn, joined by his mighty steed Mehen-Tahin, charged into their ranks, spreading chaos as never before seen by any Astrian man. His warriors, vitalized by the display, charged headfirst into the Astrian army with such ferocity that the enemy forces swiftly crumbled as many chose to surrender. Amongst the surviving prisoners, it was revealed that they were being led by Astrian high nobility, none other than Princess Ciri herself. As the Astrian Empire was spiraling deeper into turmoil, its royal children all struggling for the throne, the enlightened Ohnugdor would make the princess a proposal. The Nephiric horde could not only protect her and her men, but they were an outside force and could shift the tides of war in her favor, if only she would join them in an alliance forged through marriage. Having overcome the dangers of the dark forests of Farinost, Atark and his people had come to clash with the Astrian forces led by Princess Ciri, the youngest of the royal children. After overcoming their assailants, the Ohnugdor had offered her his aid in securing the throne. He offered an alliance bound through marriage between Ohnugdor and Empress-to-be, an offer that she would reluctantly come to accept. From but a simple people of hunters and nomads, the Nephir had come far from their humble origins. They now stood as brave warriors fighting for a land to call their own. The Ohnugdor saw before him an opportunity to do not only that, but to claim themselves an empire. Atark, realizing the enormity of his plans, saw that he was about to lead his people into a treacherous new chapter of their history. The bonds that tied the tribes together were frail, and their only unifying force was the Ohnugdor himself. If he were to perish, the tribes would undoubtedly scatter to the winds, and in these hostile lands would surely meet their demise. He needed an heir. Among those who wielded the greatest mastery over the elements and had proven themselves time and time again, one man in particular had caught Atark's eye. When they had faced the spearbeaks of Farinost, Nephiric witnessed the Ohnugdor subdue Mehen-Tahin. Not only had he followed the Atark's lead and tamed a spearbeak for himself, but he was the first to rally the warriors around him to defend their people against the creatures, putting themselves at great risk. He saw in him not only a fierce warrior, but a kindred spirit, a great man who placed the well-being of the tribe before his own, and would from then on personally mentor him in the ways of the elements. As the war continued to rage, time was in short supply, but nevertheless Atark organized a public ceremony for Princess Ciri and himself. He did not do so out of any love for the princess, but as a promise to his people, and as a statement to the Astrian soldiers who begrudgingly now followed them to battle. On that night, the Nephir were transformed from a people fumbling in the dark in a desperate bid for survival into an army with a clear purpose and ready for war. Come morning, their great journey continued. Heavily fortified and shielded by its great walls, Teninel, the capital city of Sovngarde, now blocked their path. Lacking both equipment and supplies, the Nephir were not prepared for laying siege to a city for long. They ravaged the countryside and pillaged what food and resources they could, but it was clear to the Ohnugdor that he had little time to spare and needed a swift solution. Ordering his warriors to surround the city, Atark, sensing the futility of prolonging their stay, personally led the spearbeaks in a direct assault on the walls. With their powerful talons, they quickly scaled the sheer stone walls, and with their battlements overrun by monstrous creatures, they were soon able to force open the gates. And in so doing, the city was forced to surrender. But taking the city was only the first step towards their goal. They were not here to hold the city. They were here in order to deprive the Prince Julin of his reinforcements. The Ohnugdor made the people of Terenel an ultimatum. As long as they would pay tribute to the horde and give them every single fighting man still able to hold the blade, he would allow them to maintain not only their lives but also their city. These fighters would not be taken in as soldiers in the same manner as the men under Princess Seri. The Ohnugdor had no way to ensure their loyalty, and so they would be taken as slaves, or groon, in the native tongue of the Nephir. From now on, they would have little to no rights, but if they served their masters with honor, they could one day earn their freedom, or, if they so choose, a place among the Nephir as equals. In order to prevent the people of Terenel from rising up in rebellion, and to ensure that their tribute was paid, the Rakiri tribe would remain in the kingdom of Sulangad. The rest of the horde, their numbers now bolstered, were ready to march to their next destination in the northeast, to the Gap of Atark. It was clear to everyone that Atark was very much the one in charge of their alliance, and as time passed, Princess Seri was losing control of her own army. Before they could reach the Gap of Atark, they were intercepted by a united force of Astrian and Atarnorian troops under the command of Siri's elder brother, Prince Julin. Refusing Siri's pleas to surrender, Prince Julin had set up camp on top of a nearby hill, inside the walls of the ancient fort of Cartenor. The Ohnugdor had wisely instructed his men to pitch their tents on the other side of the river. The natural barrier of rushing water hindered Julin from launching sorties to harass their camps, and the main crossing over the river was under their control. Unlike in Terenel, the terrain around Cartenor heavily favored the defenders. For near upon a month they remained at a stalemate. The Sulangad men, now under the banner of the Nephir, were uneasy about attacking Prince Julin and their fellow countrymen. With nearly no progress being made other than nightly raids and the odd sortie, Atark's patience had come to an end. As his wife pleaded with him to spare her brother, he gave him a final chance to surrender, which was, unexpectedly, summarily refused. He ordered Sulangad Gruen to assault the fort head-on, together with the bravest of his warriors. Meanwhile, Atark gathered up his most powerful shamans, and, with the spearbeaks in tow, they headed north to cut off their escape. Though the Astrians at Cartenor fought bravely to the bitter end, and claimed the lives of many Gruen and Nephir warriors in their futile assault on the walls, they were eventually destroyed. As the rituals performed by the Ohnugdor and his shamans came to their conclusion, the ruins of Cartenor were struck with all the fury of the elements. Flame rained like hail from the sky as gale winds hurled the men like dried leaves. The ground turned to mud, while the very earth itself rose in anger to sunder the ancient walls. Their astral shields, unable to withstand the assault, soon were shattered. Prince Julin, together with his men, was utterly consumed by the raging inferno. Exhilarated by their crushing victory, the horde marched throughout the night for the Gap of Atark, giving Princess Seri little time to mourn her fallen brother. Many of the Gruen and Astrian soldiers had been unable to stomach the destruction they had witnessed at Cartenor. Throughout the night, under the cover of darkness, there were many attempts to desert, but on foot they had little chance of evading their masters. Few were the men who were able to flee, and the rest were rounded up and returned to the army, or killed for their cowardice. At the Gap of Atark, the horde came across a lightly defended watchtower. Invigorated by their recent conquests, they eagerly slew the meager Atarnorian force stationed there. But before they could seize the tower, a beacon was lit at its top. Atark's eyes widened as another appeared against the night sky. Flame after flame came alight until he realized that they had stepped into a trap. From all around, the enemy descended upon them. The horde was in full disarray, but they still vastly outnumbered their assailants. Under the midnight sky, chaos ensued, and they fought throughout the night until the rising sun glistened in the blood-stained grass. To his relief, Atark saw that although scattered, the horde had managed to rout several columns of High Kingdom troops, and victory was yet within reach. The enemy was faltering, and he saw that their forces had grown weary and disorganized. The Ohnugdor, together with his fearsome spearbeak Mehen Tahin, rode for the enemy lines in a bid to break through their center and allow his riders through to surround the Astrians. They barreled through the army, felling men with every stride, when suddenly his beloved spearbeak came to a violent stop as its head exploded into a cascade of brains and blood. Atark slammed into the blood-smeared ground, the air knocked out of his lungs, gasping for breath and struggling to his feet, his weapon still in iron grip. He saw before him a man with hair like fire. Before he could act, Atark could feel the air around him begin to tingle with energy, and every hair on his body stood on its end. He met the man's gaze, eyes glowing like embers, and with an intense flash of light, the Ohnugdor was no more. As the flash of light subsided, an eerie silence washed over the battlefield. Nephir and Astrians alike, for but a brief moment, came to a stop, next to the headless carcass of the great white beast that was once his noble companion. There lay the smoldering remains of their greatest champion, their leader. Nulik looked on in terror, as in the very next instant the Astrian army erupted into a battle cry so fierce that it near took the air out of his lungs. With their warriors now in shock and disarray, Nulik saw no choice but to sound the retreat, to save as many as he could. However, many of their men remained entangled in the chaos of battle, and although he led the spearbeaks to cover the retreat, the warriors left behind were inevitably cut down. As he guided his warriors back to Tenanel, his mind could not let go of what he had seen. Deep within his heart, he could sense it. A cold fear had awakened. What sort of man could so easily take the life of someone like his master? With the seat of Ohnugdor now vacant, Nulik was meant to take the reins, to hold together a horde already showing signs of splintering. But Nulik knew that he could not simply replace a leader such as Atark Zahn. His ascension to Ohnugdor would yield but a hollow title bereft of meaning, and few of the tribes would respect him as they had his master. Haunted by the memory of the man with flaming hair and cursing his own weakness, Nulik made a promise to the tribes. He would undertake the selfsame trials that represented Atark's rise to Ohnugdor. He would prove to them that he was worthy of their loyalty, but more so, he would prove to himself that it was true. Following Atark's death, Nulik felt himself filled with rage, with anger. He saw the tribes and their warlords grow increasingly restless and malcontent, fighting amongst one another, tugging at the scraps of Salangad and Annenvale, as Princess Seri had pushed onward from the Gap of Adenor, subsequently losing her life at the hands of her sister. Their promised land seemed to drift further away from their grasp, after all that they had toiled for. Everything they had sacrificed, he would not let it all be for naught. By the guidance of the great spirits, Nulik completed the trials, just like his master had done before him. Having proven himself to be the worthy speaker of the Allfather, he began to curry favor with the warlords of the tribes, working his way to garnering support within the month of Atark's death. Nulik then proclaimed a war against the Astrians, a great war of vengeance against those who had dared to strike down the speaker of the great spirits, a campaign to avenge the death of Atark Zahn, and to avenge the death of Princess Seri, whose memory Nulik had begun to nurture from an opportunistic betrothal into a unifying standard, under which they would lay claim to their promised lands, no matter the cost. But not all would hearken to their new leader, let alone recognize him as Ohnugdor. Many would return to the Boscanar Confederation that had grown in strength in Annenvale, whilst others would rally against Nulik in a bid to return home, and to end their war with Astria. The Alteri had long been at odds with the Ohnugdor and had grown into a leading party of the opposition. In that moment, seeing no other solution to stop the horde from shattering, Nulik challenged the chieftain of the Alteri, a warrior of no mean repute, to a battle to the death. Nulik was forbidden from calling upon the aid of the great spirits, as it was the spirit of man that would display their righteousness, to show their true valor. In a brutal duel where he was left wounded and scarred, Nulik had managed to overpower his opponent and emerged victorious. He had once again proven that the Allfather was indeed with him, and that his cause was just. The opposing tribes, no matter their grudges or misgivings, had no choice but to bend to his will. And so began a long, grueling campaign against Astria and their High Kingdom allies. In the quest for their promised land, there were few places in the High Kingdom that did not feel the touch of their steel. They fought their way far north around the Asilian mountain range that shielded Ardenor, and into the rough hills of southern Ruthmere. They struck south into Ardenor, and eventually even eastern Ithrin would not remain unscathed by their wrath. The people of the High Kingdoms would over time come to forget the meaning of peace, as their subjugation at the hands of the Horde remained relentless, decade after decade. Ultimately, the name of Atark Zahn came to fade from memory and into legend, and with time, Nulik and many more great champions of the Nephir would come to join him. Generation after generation, whose lives would unavoidably be touched by war, until finally nigh on 2 centuries of strife had passed. The various High Kingdoms, now separated from their Astrian allies, had been forced to their knees by the Horde. All but the few who had yet to relent now paid tribute to the tribes in order to maintain a semblance of normalcy. The armies of the Astrian Empire had been fighting a retreating battle, abandoning the Westfold to the heavily fortified pass of Anendros. There, across the lone bridge spanning the great river of Ossos, at the river city of Estios, the Empire was making its final stand. Originally, little more than hunters and nomads, living day by day in a desperate bid for survival, only to be forced into a dishonorable exile, the Nephir had grown into a proud warrior nation, adept at the art of subjugation and war. Armed with weapons and armor scavenged and stolen from the kingdoms, or otherwise procured from the distant western powers, the Nephir of now foregone times was but a kindling set to spark the proud wildfire now raging across the lands. Oktir Edzer, the now reigning Ohnugdor, had called upon the tribal war chiefs to join him in what was to be the greatest battle yet. They would descend upon the reeling empire like a storm, and pour into their territories to avenge their precious Seri, and finally lay claim to their long-sought promised land.